So it's been a little over 2 months since we launched Buried Giant, and we thought we'd provide you with an update of how it's been going. These have been probably the most productive months of my professional life. I think that's true for most of the team too. We built a website, we launched a giant web store, and we also finished the development on Oath New Foundations. As if that weren't enough, we also initiated the pre-press process for 5 separate products. And we've also started work on the new ARX expansions. Now, because of the nature of ARX, these expansions have been much easier to complete than the work on New Foundations. Now, there's a lot to talk about and how those things came to being. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be releasing more designer diaries like this that are going to offer you a view into our design and development process. But before we jump over to ARX, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work we're doing at Buried Giant Studios and how we approach our projects and what you can all expect going forward. Now, a few days ago, somebody asked me on Discord about how we priced our games. I hadn't planned on writing a long response, but as I answered the question, I realized that I had never really spoken directly about how we do this and how it reflects our core business model. So I thought, in the interest of studio transparency, that we could use this first diary as a time to talk about those things plainly. And of course, we'll also talk a little bit about how this reflects our priorities for supporting titles and what players can expect from us as we launch our next project. Okay, let's start with the basics. So if you're in the business of selling things, you set your prices between 5 and 10 times more than the thing's production cost. This formula has proven very resilient over decades, maybe even centuries. Now, there's a wide range for variation, and this depends on a few things. The biggest one, for us at least, is how many copies we're planning on selling directly to customers versus through stores and distributors. For historical games, we know that a larger number of folks are buying those games directly, so we can get closer to the lower end of that pricing spectrum. Now, something like ARX needs to be a little cheaper, so we can manage to sell it to wholesalers and stores and still keep the prices sustainable for our partners in those areas. This also means that, generally speaking, we make a little bit more money on a copy of ARX that we sell directly than a copy of Pamir, but this is largely offset by the fact that many more copies of ARX are going through regular distribution and retail channels. When Drew and I started Whirligig, we priced our products at the very lowest end of viability. Pamir costs nearly twice as much to produce as ARX, and Giant Company is between 2 and 3 times more expensive still. But we also sell a larger portion of these games directly to customers, which helps us offset this cost. The pricing structure demands a lot of caution on our part. That was especially true during the early days of Whirligig. Thankfully, Drew and I also benefited from having a tiny overhead. It was very easy for us to lower our take-home pay to compensate for a year where we had fewer sales. And that was by design. It was a side gig. Now, with Buried Giant Studios, some of those tools are gone. In the formation of this company, we wanted to make sure that we could keep a great team together. And that means starting with a larger staff and a lot more overhead. Of course, Oath and ARX help us a lot with this, since they're good sellers already. But it also means that we have to adjust our business plan just a bit. Mostly that's good for you all, because it means that we'll have to do more regular releases, especially for the first couple of years. For us, it means more work, but we don't mind that too much. Now, so far I've only talked about prices in terms of production costs. But what about the price of actual design, development, graphics, and art? Broadly, these are fixed costs. We don't pass them on to the customers. Now, we do this mostly because we don't want to warp the incentives of the game-making process. Folks are buying the final game. They aren't buying the team sweat. They aren't buying the art. They aren't buying the extra time testing. If a game ever gets delayed, it's because I thought it would do better if it had more time. As those of you who have followed our previous projects know, I don't really hesitate to delay games if I think they could benefit from more time. Now, this doesn't mean that we can make a game at any price point. Our production budgets are usually informed by our peers. For instance, when we started working on Pamir, basically as soon as we had imagined the size of the box, we knew it was going to be a $60 to $90 game. Now, that price didn't come out of thin air. We looked at the market and other games that had similar player counts, weights, sizes, and productions, and we thought that we could do well with our competition if we priced the game in that area. Now, of course, I want to stuff every game we publish to the gills with content and good design, but price is mostly a function of the factory cost of the game and how we see the game relating to its peers. Now, there are places where there's a little bit more flexibility than you might expect, but those are mostly places where the market has been proven to bear the costs of design and art. Let me give 2 examples. Let's look at Giant Company and Oath. Both of them cost more than $100, and in both cases, I was initially very wary of building a design at that price point. I knew that we could build an $120 game in terms of value. We have lots of ways to spend art and design budgets, but I wasn't sure if the market would vindicate us. Do people really want a game that expensive? Thankfully, my wariness proved misplaced. The games performed very well and they were strong sellers. And while I don't only want to design games for an audience willing to pay that much money for a title like that, the fact that they are out there gives us the freedom to explore really big projects. And that same confidence allowed us to jump into the work of ARC's Blighted Reach campaign without too much hesitation. We knew it was a safe bet. People wanted us to build something big. Now, it's worth noting, and stepping back for a second, that these pricing tools are about giving us the financial space we need to do our work. Indeed, this is true of pretty much every game company. Without these tools, we simply don't get fed. This is why the tariffs were, and maybe continue to be, so scary. They eat into our ability to build cash reserves, which would otherwise be used for additional development costs. Now, our margins on these games, coupled with the direct sales made possible through crowdfunding, allow us to maintain a well-paid and full-time creative staff. Without it, we'd be working other jobs, and games of this scope simply wouldn't be possible. Now, before Kickstarter, most game publishers in the indie space were usually one- or two-person affairs with a bunch of contractors that were brought in on a project-to-project basis. In contrast, Buried Giant Studios has been able to start with 8 full-time staff. Now, every publisher that I know in the tabletop space has a different approach, and the rise of crowdfunding over the past decade has greatly expanded the types of businesses that can thrive in this space. However, I'm a partisan for a specific approach. I consider the full-time employment of folks in a long-term creative endeavor to be the foundational element of our business strategy. I want folks making games to be able to put themselves fully into their work. So when I talk about the studio model of game making, that's really what I'm talking about. Now, this is not the only way to make games, but it's the way that we want to make them. I think this model is very well suited to the sorts of games that we make for a couple of reasons. First, the kinds of deep focus and expertise that you get from a full-time staff allows us to work at the frontiers of the form. We have the security to ask hard questions about what games can and cannot do, and can experiment freely. I think of games as existing in a constant dialogue with their communities. And I think you also need a full-time staff to properly engage in that dialogue. We're not trying to be interlopers in community spaces. We want to be members in those spaces. These are living games fundamentally, and they have an amazing community that includes all of you. So this is about far more than just playtesting. It's about the strategy conversations that keep you up late, the events that you might attend at a convention, or the fan variant that you might steal a few minutes to post on your lunch break. We're all discovering what these games can do, and we simply couldn't do our work without your help. Now, this openness is not for everyone, and it has real consequences for how we think about our games. I think our work over the past couple of months on both Molly House and Oath demonstrates our commitment to that dialogue. So when we started preparing the second printing of Molly House, we knew we wanted to improve the production a bit to help the players playing the game in low light conditions. Really, of all of our games, Molly House should be playable in a dimly lit room. We also made space in that upgrade pack to include some reprinted cards. Now, when we initially pitched the Kickstarter, we didn't know what cards would be in that upgrade kit, but we did know that we wanted to have a little bit of room in case we found things during the extended testing after the game's release. While we were looking at Molly House, we found that we could subtly improve the balance of a couple of items and clarify the wording on some others. We didn't do this because anything was broken. We did it because we knew that we could make it better and it wouldn't cost us much to do so. In other words, we don't stop working on our games when the Kickstarter ends, we don't stop working on our games when the packages are in the mail, and we don't stop working on our games after the retail release date. These games are living objects. They exist in their communities, and we are part of those communities. If we can make them better, we're going to. The work of New Foundations was driven by this philosophy too. Months before we began that project, there were voices who encouraged us to just design more content, leave the game intact. In other words, they wanted a traditional expansion, but Oath was not designed to be expanded in that way. And I knew that the best version of Oath would require months of careful study and a willingness to do the messy work of design. Don't get me wrong, I love Oath. I'm tremendously proud of it. It won a heap of awards, it found an amazing audience. But in talking with that audience in the many years since its release, I realized that there's still a lot that could be possible. And I knew that there was a lot to be gained by opening up ourselves to those possibilities. When we approached the project, we decided to look at it basically the same way that a video game design team would approach a game's post-release support. We didn't want to start over. We were still clearly working within Oath, both in terms of its mechanical core and its governing philosophy. At the same time, we were unafraid to strengthen and rebuild where that was necessary. Now, not every developer is cut out for this kind of careful work, but the team here is uniquely suited to it. We love these sprawling designs. We love how they seep into your thinking and make you question what might be possible within them. Working on New Foundations has been a real joy. I'm tremendously proud of what we've accomplished. Not every system I thought would exist in the final game found its way into the design, but on a whole, it measured up to its highest ambitions. This brings me to our upcoming project, ARX Beyond the Reach. Unlike Oath, ARX was designed from the ground up with this kind of post-release support in mind. We started working on the design for these expansions in the months following the game's initial release, when the work of ARX was fresh in our minds. And even with only a couple months of proper work done this year, we have already generated a tremendous amount of playable content. With Oath, it often felt like we were trying to renovate an old house with walls of plaster and lath. We did our best to make the new work match the bones of the old house, finding reclaimed bricks, figuring out the right plaster mix, and so on. We didn't want people to notice that we had done a lot of work on the core chassis. But ARX is Legos. The core system is incredibly robust and flexible. Of all the games I've worked on, it's easily the most fun to design for. Working on an expansion for ARX is as easy as pulling out a bucket of extra bricks, dumping them on the floor, and seeing what you can build. The trick is to find systems that feel like they belong in the game. It's easy to build a new spaceship to play with, but it can be a challenge to build something that feels like it belongs in the world, and that makes the game all the better for its inclusion. Thankfully, we have a team that is up to the task. Now, ARX and its Blighted Reach campaign were always meant as the first steps in a much wider world. As expansive as that game is, it's also incomplete. In the weeks and months after we finished ARX back in 2023, I started compiling a roadmap for the game's expansion. I didn't know if ARX would find its audience, but if it did, I wanted to be ready. Usually I don't say much about how projects are finished. The days are hectic. They're filled with 1,000 small editorial decisions, lots of graphic design work, testing, and unplanned meetings. There's usually no time to sit down and write a long essay. It would be indulgent. Nobody wants to read a long design essay when a game is so close to being complete. People want their game, and I want to give it to them. And yet, in the case of ARX, those final weeks were critical. So, we'll be talking later about how those final weeks shaped our plans for the game and how they set the stage for ARX Beyond the Reach.